totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where every episode is there in both audio and video, exclusive video segments. Got a blog there. Also find out what the latest rock book releases are, and a Booked on Rock store now. T-shirts, stickers, hoodies, mugs, all in the store. You can find that at bookedonrock.com. Our guest is Pete Prown. He's the author of The Ultimate Book of Blues Guitar Legends, the players and guitars that shaped the music. It features over 150 of the genre's greatest players and performers from the pre-war era to present. From blues pioneers like Robert Johnson, Son House, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and Memphis Minnie, to today's hottest guitar slingers like Derek Trucks, Joe Bonamassa, Gary Clark Jr., and Samantha Fish. Prown presents his subjects by blues-defining eras and subgenres, including early acoustic and country blues, Chicago blues, the British Invasion, blues rock, and more. Examine specific noteworthy guitars each player made famous, as well as effects pedals, amplifiers, and career overviews that include the player's first-person revelations and insights. And put together a playlist to go with this episode. You can find that in this episode's show notes. Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate it.
This book, I think, is a home run for fans of classic rock because, as you write in the introduction, it puts an emphasis on the electric blues, which is so integral to some of the greatest guitarists in rock history, like Clapton, like Hendrix, Page, Duane Allman, so many others. Can you talk about why it was important for you to focus on the electric blues?
I think it's a couple reasons. Acoustic blues is a huge subject. I mean, the book could have been twice as long, easily. And really, it's almost like a different creature in a sense. What I try to do is by devoting the first quarter of the book to mostly acoustic blues is to make that the gateway to get people to listen to that music because it's incredible. I mean, journey into early acoustic blues in the 1920s and 30s. It's amazing music. It will change your life. But most people know the electric, they know the blues rock, they know the classic rock. So I'm trying to get people to explore the history of that blues guitar.
Let's go back to the beginning, when and where the blues began. You write, quote, most scholars agree that early sounds of the blues emerged around the 1890s, long before records and radio could document the historic moment. Can you talk about what has been documented and how far back can we go? Well,
the earliest music called a blues was before records. Records came about 1920 or during World War I. So that's 1914 to 1918, the teens, the earliest records. Before that was sheet music. So that's what people would be getting. And around 1912, there was actually sheet music called something blues, St. Louis blues. To our ears, it wouldn't sound like blues. It sounded like ragtime. The sound that we call blues, that 1-4-5 blues progression, that finally made it to record about 1920. So it was really just like the war came, the records came right after the war, 78 records, radio was growing, people started hearing all this different kind of music. That's when the blues, for our purposes, begins. But before then, I mean, we don't know. We'll never know when the blues actually started.
When can we pinpoint the start of the electric blues, and who do we credit for the plugged-in era of the blues starting?
Well, I mean, as is often the case, music follows innovations in technology. So in the 1930s is when we've got the first electrified guitars. The first ones were lap steels because everybody was into Hawaiian guitar back then. But then people made electric regular guitars, 6-string guitars, and tenor guitars. So once people plugged in, the guitar players would say, oh, wait a minute, I can now be as loud as the horn section. So then you had jazz and blues guitarists plugging in, like this guy. If you read in the book, you'll read about George Barnes. He's very obscure. He started playing as a teenager in the 1930s, but he played jazz and blues. I mean, he played as on later years, he played on Beach Boys records. I mean,
Wow.
This is he's one of those figures that you just don't know about. But the big bang of electric blues would be T-Bone Walker. So T-Bone Walker, his career sort of was taking shape during World War II. This is the 1940s finally. So people are getting electric guitars, they're getting amplifiers. T-Bone Walker finally plugs in a guitar and plays a style of urban blues that becomes that hit Stormy Monday Blues, which is the standard that was on the Allman Brothers record. That's where most people know it from. But that is the big boom. That album was a huge hit, and just everybody heard it.
And there are names in this book that many may not be aware of. There are over 150 guitarists covered in this book. And I want to get to just some of them as we move through the eras. And it's so important to start with Son House.
Yeah.
Right. You write, quote, today, far more people remember his disciple, Robert Johnson, than House himself, but the latter's impact on Delta blues will never be diminished. I only found out about Son House maybe a handful of years ago in a Robert Johnson documentary on Netflix,
Yeah.
I think it was. Who is Son House? Can you talk about his importance to the blues?
Well, he's one of countless traveling bluesmen in the South. So this is the Jim Crow South. It's very repressive. If you're an African American, it was a harsh place to live. You were very poor. Musicians would make money by just walking from town to town and playing on a street corner, at a barbershop, at a juke joint for coins, pennies, maybe $1 or $2. And Son was one of the many, but he would have met Robert Johnson at some point and taught him some chords, just like a mentor meeting a young guitarist and offering some tips. Maybe there was a lesson. I don't know what the transaction was, but he was a mentor to Robert Johnson. But these guys they were just traveling around the South and doing anything to make a living making music. But it was a really difficult life, and Son House is one of the important ones. But really what's also important is that his career sort of fizzled out by the 30s, but then he was rediscovered almost 30 years later in the 1960s. So as an old man, he was now brought back, put in front of these, college kid audiences and festivals of the 1960s. And that's when people finally heard about Son House.
Which is what happened with some more of these artists. Years later, they're appreciated, like John Lee Hooker or Muddy Waters. We'll get to those guys too. But the urban legend of Robert Johnson, he sold his soul to the devil, and all of a sudden he plays guitar. Yeah. It was Son House, right? Wasn't he? Robert Johnson went away for a while and was with Son House during that time.
It's possible,
no?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really hard to document anything back then. I read very detailed histories of Robert Johnson, and they all say we don't have any documentation because he's just traveling from place to place. There's no receipts, there's no bills, there's no letters, there's nothing.
There's only one photo or two photos of him.
Two photos, yeah. So it's a mystery, and we'll probably never know what really happened.
And that lends to the myth of Robert Johnson.
Yeah,
I think we know.
I think the myth of Robert Johnson is like the myth of Eric Clapton, because Clapton, quit the Yardbirds and then came back with John Mayall as this monster guitar player. I think Robert Johnson also took some time off to woodshed and got really good. And then that's what happened. It's a better story to say you sold your soul to the devil.
Right. It makes for, it makes for a better story. Yeah. Robert Johnson's story is amazing just on its own without all of that, just the things that he did and the sounds. Because it's true, Eric Clapton talked about how when you listen to him, it almost sounds like there are two people playing guitar. Mm-hmm. The things that he was doing were way ahead of his time. And your book gets to what you say is the heart of the matter, which is the music he recorded while he's alive. You write, quote, the music itself is Spartan, but the overall vocal and guitar delivery is complex and masterful. Can you expand on that? Maybe a few songs that stand out to you as great examples of his skills.
Well, listen to like Sweet Home Chicago. That's one of the classics, or Crossroads, because he's playing a fingerstyle guitar with a slide. He's keeping the bass with his thumb. He's playing some chords with his fingers. He's doing lead licks with the slide, and he's singing. And most importantly, his timing is perfect. Like he really, he's a one-man band doing all these different parts, and they're all working together to build this incredible piece of music. So many musicians just don't have that great sense of time. But I mean, he felt the whole thing, the chords, the bass, the vocals, the slide guitar. I mean, how to put that all together of a man who was very poor in the 1930s and somehow put this all together and gave us this gift.
He also could have been an engineer, at least if the stories are true about him looking for the right sound. He's in a certain corner of the room is where he wanted to be to get the right echo and et cetera, et cetera. Are those stories true?
It makes good sense because even today in a recording studio, the engineer will be talking about the corners. They have reflectors and baffles and how standing waves can sit in a corner. So for him to be moving around to corners shows that he really understood sound and music. Like he could understand that he's going to sound way better over here than over there. And he's processing this in an era of pretty limited technology. I mean, he would have never had an experience with a recorder before, or not many. I mean, these are field recorders they were using. So this is early stuff.
You can hear the hissing of the tape when you listen to those songs.
Yeah. I mean, there was no magazines, there was no internet, there was no nothing. You just, might have seen one, but he just naturally, intuitively understood sound and music.
Yeah, and it's like he's the Babe Ruth of blues. He's like the original guy, right? T-Bone Walker. Go ahead.
Yeah, but Robert Johnson, like I said in the book, he's not the end. He's the beginning. He's the gateway to go into acoustic blues and learn about Son House and Bukka White and Mississippi John Hurd and Memphis Minnie. I mean, there's so much music there.
Yeah, those are the Babe Ruths, right?
Yes.
And Robert's the Mickey Mantle.
Yeah,
there you go. T-Bone Walker, his story is interesting. You write, quote, "For an artist as historically significant as T-Bone Walker, it's surprising how few modern guitarists remember his impact." So talk about his impact on the blues. You did mention it already, but maybe expand on that a little bit more.
Well, he literally was the big bang of electric blues music. I mean, he's not the first. There's never a first. As a historian, you sort of just don't even go to the first because it doesn't really exist. But he's the guy who had the hit record at a time when radio was bursting, records were all over the place, and everybody who was into music, electric music back then, heard this incredible sound. And he was a star for 10, 15 years, and then his career waned in the 60s. And then came the Claptons and the Becks and the Hendrixes, and then nobody really remembers T-Bone Walker anymore. If you just say Stormy Monday, they'll say, oh yeah, that Allman Brothers song. But he was really that guy who lit the fuse.
By the way, these blues artists have the greatest names ever. T-Bone Walker, Muddy Waters. I mean, these are the coolest names.
I did go into that a little bit in the book.
Right. Yeah. They're just
all the nicknames.
Right. Let's get into Muddy Waters, one of the essential architects of the Chicago sound.
Yeah.
He was a truck driver by day, musician by night. You say he represents a straight line between acoustic Delta and post-war electric styles. He's among the first to play bottleneck on the electric guitar, which is a fascinating topic. You devote a chapter to the bottleneck guitar. You talk about how it can be daunting at first when trying to understand it. When did this style originate? And can you talk about the different variations that there are?
Again, we don't know when it first came out. I mean, like I said earlier, the Hawaiian guitar was very popular during World War I. Hawaiian guitar is basically an acoustic guitar or a lap steel sitting on your lap, flat on your lap. And you would have a slide in one hand and you'd be picking with the other hand and playing slide guitar. So everybody would have heard of that. It was a really big guitar fad. So it's hard to know if that then jumped to the blues and Muddy picked it up that way. But there's one of the bluesmen I talk about there was talking about how he got his start playing slide using a beef bone. You could use anything. I mean, it was a bottleneck. Bottleneck guitar is literally like a wine bottle, and they cut off the top, the skinny part, and that's their slide, or a piece of pipe, or a beef bone. I mean, it's
or a medicine bottle, right? Dwayne Allman, right? Greg,
bottle.
yeah, Dwayne was sick. Greg went out and got him some of the medication or whatever,
Yeah.
the bottle he used.
Yeah, or a solid piece of metal, a bar, But I mean, it evolved. But once it got to the blues, then the guitar player could use it to convey the human voice in guitar form, because a slide is going to have those melismas. The melisma is the note that goes up and down like a gospel singer. And they could do that on the guitar now with a slide because it was perfectly smooth when they run it up and down the strings. So it's just a natural fit for blues music.
This is subjective, but many say of the current era guys, Derek Trucks might be the best, the slide guitar, but there are a lot of good ones.
There's a lot of good ones. I mean, I tend to think of Derek as sort of the Jimi Hendrix of today. He's not just a great he's taken it to the level of a Mozart of slide guitar. It's just not really even fathomable what he does. But then you have a zillion great slide players today.
He's has
something way up here.
Similar personality to Hendrix, I think, too. Very humble.
Yes.
Quiet. Shy, right? But he goes out there and plays, and you're just blown away by. He was. I think Greg Allman saw him when he was like 16 or something.
Oh, there's a video of Derek when he's 12 years old. I've seen that one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
And he's playing with a band of adults, and it's pretty staggering.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
When? Oh, patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Let's go to voices now. Howlin' Wolf, maybe the greatest voice in blues history. An interesting comment in the book I want to ask you about. You say, quote, "You may not equate the shock rock of Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne to the eerie blues of Howlin' Wolf, but that connection is direct and palpable. Ozzy just got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, finally. Can you expand on that statement?"
Yeah, I mean, who created this kind of menacing, evil music, dark, evil? It came out of the blues, and Howlin' Wolf, as a performer, he was like, okay, my act, my show is going to be that I'm going to be a kind of a scary guy, and I've got this incredible voice. And he wrote these songs and deliver this voice. So say you were a young Ozzy or a Clapton or Jimmy Page, and you put on this old record and you heard this voice, it would scare the heck out of you. And, a few years later, that sound wove its way into these louder and louder guitar amps and louder bands. So it really came right out of the blues. I also, Jazz Obrecht, who was one of the editors of Guitar Player magazine, had a lot to do with helping me with the book and giving me advice and good quotes. But he's the one who pointed out that Muddy Waters band in the 1950s was a really loud band. So we don't really think of loud until like, Hendrix and Cream and Zeppelin. But, people like Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, they were experimenting with really loud music and screaming vocals 15 years earlier.
Interesting.
Yeah.
P. Prown is our guest. He's the author of The Ultimate Book of Blues Guitar Legends, the players and guitars that shaped the music. Muddy Waters famously sang the blues had a baby and they named it rock and roll. At some point in the 50s is when we see the intersection of blues and rock and roll.
I think of rock music as being sort of this confluence of blues, country, and then pop and, just the regular mainstream stuff. So it's right there at the beginning. And you had someone like Bo Diddley, who was a blues guitar player. I mean, he played on Chess Records, and he was from the blues world. So it's one of the foundations. You didn't really hear it as clearly, because there's a lot of country music in early rock and roll. Even Chuck Berry, Maybelline, that's like kind of a country tune, but the chords are blues. But he had another song called Wee Wee Hours, which was like a real blues. So it's just part of the foundation of the house we call rock and roll.
Elvis, right?
Yeah. Oh, sure. It was
rockabilly.
Yeah, but I mean, he took, Hound Dog, Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog, and he did it his way and changed the blues into rock and roll and changed history.
Yeah, in the book you asked, was Sister Rosetta Thorpe a blues guitarist or gospel, jazz, boogie woogie, and rock and roll? The answer
She
is
was
all
everything.
of the above.
She was, and she really could do it all. And she was probably known in her time more as a gospel singer, because that back then she would have been a gospel singer. Today, though, we could hear so many things, and just so few women electric guitar players back then. There were some, and they were important, but not like, I mean, she was wailing on the guitar, and that's just unprecedented.
I'm wearing my Grateful Dead shirt here. What do you think of Jerry as a blues guitarist?
I do think of him as a blues
He
player.
dabbled in it from time. Red Rooster was the song they played often, which is a blues song.
Well, I mean, Jerry to me is like, he was like a sponge. He just soaked up every kind of American music and put it into the Grateful Dead and his own stuff. And so I'm always hearing like a little blues here, a little jazz there, little jug band over there, his country, his folk bluegrass. I mean, he's just like that. I mean, and there are those people who are just musical chameleons.
You're right. Yeah, a sponge for sure.
In the
Yeah.
book, I talk about Clarence Gatemouth Brown, who was one of the early electric guitar players. But he played guitar, fiddle, mandolin, drums. He played blues. He played country. He played R&B. I mean, just like Jerry, just a sponge, just incredible.
Let's get to my favorite blues artist, which is John Lee Hooker.
Okay.
And I remember working at the mall years ago, and next door was one of the record stores there. And in the bargain bin, they have all those cassettes for $2-3. And there was John Lee Hooker. And I had been interning at a radio station, a rock station in New Haven, Connecticut, that had a blues show. And I remember one of the DJs there gave me a compilation of blues songs. One of them was No Shoes by John Lee Hooker. Now, this is a song, not one of his more famous ones, I guess.
Yeah.
Blew me away.
Right.
Blew me away. The voice, the way he played, like you said, it's like hypnotic. Right. I can't recall the word that you used to describe it, but yeah, you lead the chapter by saying, quote, they say success isn't as an entertainer is all about timing, and John Lee Hooker's couldn't have been any better. So talk about the timing.
Because he was part of that very first wave of blues guitar players. So his records that came out in the late 1940s, like Crawling King Snake, these are really, really important early electric blues. But then, of course, his career sort of meandered in the 50s. But then when that whole folk boom came in the 1960s, there was John Lee Hooker. He was only about 40 years old or 45 years old, so relatively young man. And his career just took off. And for the rest of his life, he was celebrated as one of the not only great contemporary blues artists, but he had roots back to Mississippi. And that's so important for that kind of droning, menacing hill country blues. Even though he wasn't from the hill country, he had that rhythm, that is part of that style.
In the 90s, too. That was when he had that album that he put out with, I think, various guitarists.
Yeah.
Carlos Santana.
Everybody, yeah.
Was on the single, and he had his resurgence.
The Healer.
The Healer, yes.
Yeah.
Chapter 7 takes us into the British blues era. A two-part question here for you. How important is Big Bill Broonzy to this genre? And even more so, how important is the meeting of Keith Richards and Mick Jagger important to the British blues era?
Well, Bill Broonzy, he's just kind of a curious story because in America, he's not very well known, but he was one of the earliest American bluesmen to go travel and perform in the UK. He developed a huge following there. So over in Great Britain, he was a huge star. Not that many people know him in Chicago, even though he's an early Chicago bluesman. And then he died relatively young. He died in the 50s. So then, his career, it was short, it was influential, but it was mostly on those young white British guitar players who were coming up and learning rock, but then discovering blues.
Which leads us to Keith and Mick, right? They're on a train together.
Yeah, they bump into each other. Mick has some albums. He has a Muddy Waters album. He has a Chuck Berry album, and Keith notices it, and they start talking about it. And, in a sense, that early Rolling Stone sounds is sort of like this meeting of Chuck Berry music and Muddy Waters music. It has a little bit of that both, sort of just It's got some jangle and some blues, but that's where that Stones sound began.
And you do spend some time on the duo of Keith Richards and Brian Jones, but also Keith Richards and Mick Taylor.
Yeah.
Two interesting combinations. What if you had a choice, if you had to choose one of the two, would you have a preference?
I mean, I love Mick Taylor. I mean, because he's part of that Clapton, Peter Green, Mick Taylor British guitar tradition. I mean, the thing about Brian Jones is that he's important because he's sort of pre-Eric Clapton. So he was not that kind of guitar player. He could experiment and play blues, and he played slide, which is probably his most important contribution, and he named the Stones. But I mean, they're just apples and oranges.
Yeah,
really.
right. Credit to Mick too on the harmonica. The Keith Richards said that in his book. He's like, it's probably the best I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And they put out that all blues album, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, which was solid.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a huge Stones fan. Let's talk Clapton, your chapter on Eric Clapton. Fascinating. He thought Cream would be a flat out blues trio, but Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, not so. They're a little bit of everything. Can you talk about how Clapton was somehow able to still, however, infuse the blues into a mix of jazz and British pop and pull it off? Because that's not easy to do. And then some of the groundbreaking things he does with the reverb and the wah-wah pedal.
Yeah. I mean, I just reviewed his new album. So his career has been going for 60 years. His instincts are amazing. He just knows sort of when to ride the moment. And he was like, okay, I'm with these two incredible musicians, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker. They're playing all around me, all over me. I'm not going to be my buddy guy like Blues Man. But you know what? This is the moment. The fans are reacting. We got a little bit of a following. And he knows I'm going to ride this for a while. And I'm going to make myself fit in. And that is just when that cross-pollination of like Baker and Bruce's jazz and Eric's blues into this era of psychedelic rock happened. It's just, there's nothing, you can't predict it. You can't catch that lightning in a bottle. It just happened at that one moment. And Clapton was, that intuition. He's like, this is where I need to be right now. You
mentioned Jazz Obrecht, and I'm a huge Van Halen fan. And Eddie, his guy was Clapton Cream era. Eddie Van Halen, that was his guy.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I can hear it. I can really hear it in Van Halen's playing. It's not a direct thing. You're not going to hear any Clapton licks, but just the way he's speaking with authority through the guitar. That's Clapton. Clapton has this authority. When he plays, you stop and listen. And Van Halen's like, I'm going to play in my style, but when I play, you're going to listen. Yeah, When It's Love, the guitar solo on there is probably the most Clapton-esque solo from Eddie. And Alex's new book is out, and he was telling a story of how they went to see Derek and the Dominoes, and Eddie's got the binoculars trying to study what Eric Clapton is doing. But he said he was a little disappointed because he was by that time already playing differently than he was playing with Cream. Yeah, and he was probably on substances, because that would have been the last Derek and the Dominoes tour. There was only like one tour of the United States, so it probably would have been a little less than he had hoped. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
This is heavy. There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
Another well-known guitarist, guy by the name of Jimi Hendrix. Another interesting figure. There were those. You never heard of him. There were those, and maybe some still today, who will question whether he was a blues guitarist or not. His bassist Billy Cox had a great quote about that. You included in your book. Can you talk about what Billy had to say? And what's your opinion of Hendrix as a blues guitarist? Well, I would say Hendrix is a blues guitarist. He is a stone cold blues guitarist. I mean, that is where he's coming from: blues, rhythm and blues, which is James Brown and Motown and Stax, and rock and roll. But I mean, the blues is in everything he does. I mean, there's little pastiches of jazz flavors now and again, but some people speculate that he would have become a jazz fusion guitarist later. I'm not so sure about that, because the blues is really what Hendrix is about. And that's what he listened to. That was his record collection. Here's the quote from Billy Cox to Jazz Obrecht, by the way. You can call Jimi Hendrix whatever you like, but he was a blues master. You run that type of playing through a fuzz face and a loud amp, and what do you have? You have something that somebody may interpret as something else, but it's really nothing but blues. Since he was so hot on guitar, people said, wait a minute, we've never heard blues played like this. But that's what it was. Just about everything Jimmy and I recorded was blues. Everything was right from the soil, right from the depth of mankind. Blues was part of our being. Yes, great quote.
Yeah, but like Jimmy was also there taking the blues at the very dawn of funk. Jimmy was funk before nobody knew what that word meant. Purple Haze is funky, and that's 1967. So you got blues, you got funk, you got psychedelia, all happening in this one song before anybody had even figured it out. Jimmy was already there. It's amazing.
In such a short time, and then he's gone. The big guitarists of the 70s, like Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, Keith Richards, Alvin Lee of 10 years after.
Yeah.
But it's Jimmy Page you credit with introducing the blues to many teens because Zeppelin was so popular. Unlike Eric Clapton or Peter Green, Page was not solely a blues influenced player, but when he played the blues, he played it well. And you can hear it on those Zeppelin albums. Can you talk about some of the experimenting that he did on those Zeppelin albums? A good example being You Shook Me.
Yeah, I mean, he like Hendrix, he played the blues through a fuzz box, through a loud amp. So it kind of sounded like some louder psychedelic band or acid rock band. But really, he was just taking the blues and adapting it to the sonics, the technology. We talked about that earlier, because now people could have Marshall stacks. Who knows? If T-Bone Walker could have had a Marshall stack in 1947, the world might be different. But Jimmy Page had that technology in 1969, and that's why it sounded so amazing. I remember when I was 14 years old or so, I mean, I had just gotten Led Zeppelin 2 from my brother. I stole it from him. And listening to, Jimmy playing slide guitar, but I knew it was blues. And it really, really, it shook me, to quote the song. I mean,
Literally.
literally shook me like, oh my God, this is what blues guitar sounds like. And Jimmy Page opened that door.
I want to ask you about we did mention Keith Richards with Mick Taylor, Keith Richards with Brian Jones. I want to get into that blues duo area, like Duane Allman and Dickie Betts.
Mm-hmm.
That can't be so easy to pull off. Like Allman and Betts proved to be a supercharged duo, represented a paradigm shift in blues informed guitar and ensemble playing. That's what you write in the book. Yeah. But how difficult is it to pull something like that off? Like I would think this isn't something you don't just throw a few guitars together and everything's going to work out. They kind of have to share the same musical brain, or they got to play off of each other and play a lot together.
Yeah. I mean, you had two very talented guitar players. I mean, both really good rhythm guitarists. We talk about guitar solos a lot. They're both great rhythm guitarists, so they can get that bass going. I'm talking about the rhythm track of a song, and just listening to those two guys go back and forth on rhythm guitar is a perfect platform for their solos. Dickie could play blues, rock, country, jazzy stuff, and Duane had played soul. He had played blues, and so they're just such gifted musicians and pioneers in their era that they just were able, as great musicians who could play in an ensemble really well, playing in an incredible band. They changed history because of just that innate talent and the love of the music.
But having that much talent too, I would think you got to learn to step back a little bit, let the other guy do his thing. There's got to be some interplay there. Otherwise,
that's listening to they would be listening to John Coltrane records. So they'd say, okay, in jazz, you play the head and then everybody takes their solo. Then you go back to the head and then you're done. So everybody knew their job, and you definitely have to lay back, as you said.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Here to the future.
There was a blues revival in the 80s, and for that, we have to go to Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what made him so impactful? Why was he able to connect with so many fans who may not have been into the blues all that much prior?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to John Lee Hooker and timing. People in the entertainment business often say it's really all about timing. So it's the early 80s. You've got new wave music, you've got drum machines and synthesizers and Michael Jackson. And David Bowie puts out this Let's Dance song. And it's kind of an electronic dance song on the one hand, but then it's got this smoking blues guitar solo in the middle. And you're like, well, wait a minute, how does that work? And moreover, this guitar player is really hot. And that, with his first album coming out, with the press and the hype, the Stones were part of the pushing Stevie Ray out. I mean, it was just like an explosion. I mean,
The perfect storm.
And it was just the opposite of what was hot. And, everybody's doing this drum machine thing and this synthesizers. And here's a guy coming out with the most earthy guitar sound you can imagine. And I think a lot of people are like, thank goodness I don't have to listen to drum machines all day.
And FM rock radio was still big in the 80s. So he was getting a lot of play on FM rock radio. I know here in Connecticut, I used to hear him all the time. That's why I became a fan.
WPLR.
Yeah. That's the station. Yeah. Are you from Connecticut?
There.
Okay.
I'm from Orange.
Oh, so WPLR. Yeah, I was interning there, and
oh yeah,
that's where Mike Lapatino had the blues show, and he said, "Here, you want some of these CDs?" I said, "Go ahead, take them." And they were compilations. I'm in Southington, Connecticut, right between Hartford and New Haven.
Okay.
So
great.
Worked at I-95. I may be familiar with that rock station in Fairfield County.
Sure,
was there for many, many years.
Oh yeah, Fairfield, sure.
Yeah, many years. Stevie Ray Vaughan, what fascinates me about his style, he played so many notes, but so clearly, like crystal clear. You could hear everything, his tone.
Right.
It was just amazing. Now, his brother, a pretty damn good guitarist too. You do cover Jimmy Vaughan in the book.
Right. But they have very different techniques.
Right.
So I mean, Stevie Ray Vaughan, just look at look at his hands. They're huge. They're huge hands. They're very strong. He's playing with heavier strings on a Stratocaster that he tunes down a little bit, a step or two, which is an old trick of playing like bending strings, but still having a fat string. So your tone is bigger. But he's just a powerful, muscular player. Jimmy uses the lightest strings imaginable and is a much lighter player, and he bends strings really easily. So they're very, very different.
Along with Stevie Ray in the 80s, we had Robert Cray, which I remember when my older brother, big fan of him. So I knew about him back when I was a teenager in the 80s. Bonnie Raitt, we mentioned Jimmy Vaughan, Jeff Healey. George Thorogood also mentioned in the book. George Thorogood, I think, should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I think so too.
I mean, Bad to the Bone alone just brought blues into the mainstream.
Yeah, because he was, when I first was aware of him, he was like a barroom blues player. He went and played Toad's Place or, wherever. But in Philly in the early 90s, there was an event at the Philadelphia Spectrum, and he brought 10,000 people showed up, and he just blew the roof off that place. The guy just, it's a powerful, simple delivery of the blues. So if you go back to a bluesman like Jimmy Reed was a very popular blues guitarist in the 50s. His music is really simple, very simple, but that's how you communicate the music to a lot of people. And George was like that.
On the slide, very good. One of the songs I always put together a playlist for these episodes. One of the songs I wanted to include among the Thorogood songs is the live Sky is Crying, that live album. And that's where he's playing the slide on that track, man. It's one of my favorite Thorogood tracks.
Yeah.
What about Billy Gibbons? There's an interesting one too. Huge in the 70s and 80s, still able to keep that blues sound on Eliminator.
Yeah.
And even while they're transitioning into the synthesizers and that type of thing.
I think a lot of people would agree that, Billy Gibbons is one of those super talents, but he is ZZ Top in a lot of ways. He's the voice, he's the look, he's the guitar player. He's a phenomenal guitar player. I'm going to go back to Robert Johnson and having a great sense of time. Billy has an incredible sense of time. So when he does that groove, that boogie, he nails it, and he does the slide. That kind of guitar playing is going to be relevant always. It's never going to go out of style.
One of the greatest. Along comes another generation of bluesmen in the 90s, Kenny Wayne Shepherd and Johnny Lang. And then it continued with Joe Bonamassa. We mentioned Derek Trucks, Gary Clark Jr., Warren Haynes. We haven't mentioned him yet.
Yeah.
Fantastic guitarist.
Absolutely.
Many I've been fortunate enough to see live. Can you talk about this in the book, how the internet, YouTube, and streaming platforms has actually benefited the blues? There's a downside to that they always talk about, but the new generations are not only discovering the music, but they're learning from these sources too.
Yeah. YouTube is, it's guitar lessons day and night, 24 hours a day. You want to learn any kind of blues, whether it's electric blues, Piedmont blues, urban blues of the 40s, anything, you can learn it, and it's right there. And if you have Spotify or Pandora, like I could be, off somewhere and I'll just put on, say, Howlin' Wolf, and suddenly I'm listening to some of the greatest blues records of all time, no matter where I am. How is that? It's just the world is connected so effortlessly these days.
I put together a playlist, like I said, I think it clocks in at 29 hours. I kept adding. Yeah, let's put this. Hey, let's put him in. Let's put her. Well, I should say her too. Bonnie Raitt, another great,
incredible guitar player.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I'm ashamed to say this guy, Chris Stone, Kingfish Ingram, I didn't know about him until now. I read your book. So, okay, let me check out this guy. Wow. I think he's only in his 20s.
Yeah.
And you call him one of the brightest lights in contemporary blues.
He's from Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is the spiritual home of the blues.
Right.
That's where he grew up. And he, as a kid, would go to the local blues museum because they have one. And he was like, all right, I like this. I like what I'm hearing, and I'm going to play. And, he's a phenomenon. So
there's hope for the future. I don't think blues will ever go away. Where do you see the blues today, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, it just keeps. I think it's always going to be here. We tend to be in a period for the past 20 years ago where we're still repeating a lot of what's happened. I think what happened between 1920 and 2000, that 80 years of blues guitar, it's so vast that it's hard to be a blues guitarist today and say, I want to take it someplace else. I'm not sure there are that many people who can do that. I've heard there's some African blues guitar players who are doing very interesting stuff because they're mixing in African music. So that's a whole different thing. It's fantastic.
I think Gary Clark Jr. does that too. He's incorporating some of the newer production elements.
Yeah. There's blues and hip hop, which is cool. Mm-hmm. Who knows what AI is going to do to the blues? It could do anything. You could just write a blues every day if you want. Yeah.
One thing I didn't ask you about, but people should also be aware too, that this book, it does examine not just the guitarist, but effects pedals and amplifiers and a lot of that stuff too. Talk about that, what people can read regarding that aspect of the blues in the book.
Well, the technology, again, the music often follows the technology. So in the 20s, when blues guitar was taking off, the guitars had actually at that point just started to be made better. They had truss rods in the neck, so the necks weren't bowing so much. They were better construction. So, every time there's an advancement in technology, all music follows, all art follows, but the blues follows that. So, it's just, this is the language, but the technology is an important part of it. When Leo Fender invented the Telecaster and the Stratocaster, it didn't take that long for blues guitarists to grab those things and say, okay, these are the new tools for today, and change the world with that.
The read is fascinating, but it's laid out beautifully. It's a phenomenal book. It's a must read for any blues fan. And I believe it is out now, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So the ultimate book of blues guitar legends, the players and guitars that shape the music, out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. Mm-hmm. And where can people find you online, Pete?
They can find me on, actually, if they go to peteprown.com, it's my artwork. So best was to read Vintage Guitar Magazine, Tone Quest Report, and look for my latest books.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. Thanks so much for being here.
Appreciate it. Had a great time. Thanks.
That's it. It's in the books.